Science, Volume 266. The 18th of November, 1994. Pages 1202 to 1208. 7 authors. The title is flat. The paper establishes that an aerosol of anthrax escaped from a Soviet military facility on the 2nd of April, 1979, and that the people who died had been standing downwind of it. The first author is Matthew Meselson, a molecular biologist at Harvard. 8 years earlier, he had gone to Moscow, listened to Soviet officials explain the same deaths, and published their explanation. He had been asking to visit the city since 1980. When permission finally came, he went, and what he brought back overturned the account he had carried home in '86. The Soviet account was that the deaths came from anthrax-contaminated meat. It was false. It held in the West for 13 years, and for most of them, nobody was enforcing it. There was no threat attached, no bargain, no scientist was leaned on. The account survived because it was well built, and because the people it was told to could not disprove it. Sverdlovsk sits 850 miles east of Moscow, in the Urals. In 1979, it was closed to foreigners. 87% of what it made was military. Start where the account was strongest. April 1988. 3 Soviet scientists came to the United States and gave American colleagues a full account of the outbreak. The delegation was led by Pyotr Burgasov. Burgasov was a retired deputy minister of health. He had led the Soviet response in Sverdlovsk in '79. He had also worked inside the Soviet biological weapons program since 1950. Science reported that month that the mystery epidemic had lost much of its mystery. Most of the American scientists in the room received the account positively. The United States government remained unconvinced. What they presented was specific. Cattle infected with anthrax, rendered into bone meal at a slaughterhouse in March '79. The bone meal fed back to livestock. That had been the Soviet position since September '86. The infected animals were then slaughtered and sold by private vendors outside veterinary inspection. The Soviet state was, in this telling, guilty of one thing: failing to police its own meat trade. A small, embarrassing, plausible admission. 79 people with the intestinal form of the disease, of whom 64 died, 17 with the skin form. Cases from the 4th of April to the 18th of May. Almost all adults, mostly men. The account had dates. It had a mechanism. Its numbers were not round, and it explained why the epidemic ran on for 6 weeks, which is the detail that mattered most. 2 years earlier, in September 1986, Meselson had been flown to Moscow at Soviet invitation and given 4 days. He met senior health officials, Burgasov among them, at the Botkin Hospital. He wrote down what he was told and published it in the Bulletin of the Federation of American Scientists. He opened the article by stating that this was what the Russians had said to him. Speaking in 2025, he said he should have gone further. He should have made clear that this was not necessarily what he believed. A lot of people reading it thought that it was. He was accused of being a Soviet apologist. His actual position was narrower than either side wanted. The explanation might be true. It was not proven. The only way to settle it was to go. He had wanted to go since 1980 and would go on asking for 12 more years. In '88, he stated that contrary to the United States government version, there was no evidence of inhalatory anthrax. The Soviet explanation was not crude, and this is the part that decides the episode. It fitted the evidence available in the West. On one point, it fitted better than the American version. Anthrax does not pass between people. If a cloud had crossed the southern districts, everyone exposed would have breathed it within the same few hours, and the cases would have arrived together and stopped. The cases did not arrive together. They arrived across about 6 weeks. Contaminated meat, eaten by different households on different days, produces precisely that shape. An aerosol released once does not. Meselson worked that out in 1980. So, separately, did an admiral at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Both concluded the Soviet account was at least plausible, On the evidence then available, it was. There was a second problem underneath. Settling the question meant telling the inhaled form of the disease apart from the ingested form, and the medical literature on that point barely existed. On the 4th of September 1980, a microbiologist at Bradford argued in New Scientist that the two forms could not be distinguished at all. British and American officials took it seriously enough to commission a rebuttal. Government scientists at Porton Down were asked what they thought. Perhaps 10 cases of the intestinal form had ever been documented outside the Soviet Union. Their advice was that no judgment should rest on one kind of evidence or one case. The region had a long history of natural anthrax in livestock. The Russian name for the disease translates as Siberian ulcer. An outbreak in the Urals in spring was not, on its face, remarkable, and there was almost nothing to check the account against. The city was closed. The hospital records had been taken in '79. No photographs, no site access, no witnesses the West could reach. There was one exception, and it cut the other way. Donald Ellis, an American physicist, spent that spring in Sverdlovsk on an academy exchange, driving his children to school each weekday. He learned about the epidemic after he came home. Now back further, to the thing the account was built over. Compound 19 was a military base in the south of the city, operational since 1949, 200 hectares, 7,000 residents. By the 70s, its main work was anthrax. On the 2nd of April 1979, spores escaped from a 4-story building in the compound's special zone. Russian sources describe a defect in the system, carrying exhaust from a spray dryer. The wind was from the north. It carried south, across the Chkalovsky district, and past the city limit into farmland. 6 villages later reported anthrax in livestock along the same line. 4 of them, Meselson noticed in '80, were exactly in a row. A ceramics factory stood directly south of the compound. It employed 2,180 people and drew its ventilation air from outside. At least 18 of its workers died. The first deaths came 2 days after the release. The response was not small. Around 80% of some 59,000 eligible residents of the district were vaccinated. Households were given tetracycline. Bedding and clothing were collected. Sick rooms were disinfected. From the 22nd of April, buildings were hosed with chlorine and topsoil scraped where animals had been buried. American analysts pointed at exactly this. That is not containment of anthrax from bad meat. It is decontamination of surfaces after an aerosol. The first word of any of it reached the West in January 1980, in an émigré magazine published in Frankfurt called Pasef. It reported an anthrax outbreak following an explosion at a military settlement. A CIA report from October 1979 had logged rumors of a biological warfare accident with 40 to 60 dead. On the 3rd of March 1980, a Defense Intelligence Agency appraisal put a high probability on the inhaled form. The first review conference of the Biological Weapons Convention opened in Geneva on the 3rd of March 1980. The American delegation was briefed on the allegations minutes before it gave its opening statement. Washington approached Moscow on the 17th of March. It did not accuse the Soviet Union of building weapons. It went in under Article 5, which obliges parties to consult. It was the least confrontational route available. The reply came 3 days later, as an oral statement by Viktor Komplektov of the Soviet Foreign Ministry, handed over as a non-paper. It confirmed the outbreak. It called the causes natural. It named meat sold without observance of veterinary supervision. Then it closed. The impression is automatically created, the statement said, that someone would like, under a clearly invented pretext, to cast a shadow on one of the most important agreements in the arms control area. That is the whole architecture in one paragraph. Concede the deaths, detach them from the treaty, then make the treaty the thing under attack and the questioner the one attacking it. The position did not move for 12 years. Britain followed. On the 12th of November 1980, the British ambassador in Moscow pressed for a serious answer rather than the same one again. The file records the response as dusty. The Foreign Office drew up an escalation ladder from a bilateral approach up to the Security Council and wrote alongside it what they expected. None of us believe, the note reads, that there is much chance of the Russians changing their version. The Ministry of Defense objected. Pressing Article 5, its head of section wrote, would only demonstrate that Article 5 did not work. If the Russians still refused, the option left was withdrawal from the convention, which he called unthinkable. The head of the American delegation made a remark that has aged strangely. The Russians, he said, might have painted themselves into a corner. Had they simply called it defensive research, which the convention permits, it could hardly have been disputed. They never needed to. By the middle of December 1980, the American administration had changed, and the matter was placed largely in abeyance. The ladder was never climbed past its second rung. From here, the record thins, and the thinness is the subject. For most of the 80s, there was no investigation. There was a Soviet account, an American suspicion, and no mechanism for settling between them. The United States asked Moscow to explain Sverdlovsk 9 times between 1980 and 1989. Every request was refused, and refused procedurally. The outbreak was not covered by the convention, so there was nothing to consult about. Meselson kept applying through whatever channel existed. He asked through Pugwash and got as far as a Soviet official agreeing. Then the Soviet Air Force shot down a Korean airliner and the invitation was withdrawn. He sent a message through a cardiologist traveling to Moscow. A telex came back from the health minister's assistant saying he had gone to Sverdlovsk himself to save Meselson the trouble, and there was nothing there. In 1986, the Soviet account was not defended. It was expanded. The bone meal was added. The slaughterhouse was dated. The chain from feed to household was made specific, and the case dates published. A story that gains detail under questioning reads to most people like a story being confirmed. There is no way to tell those apart from the outside without access, and access was the one thing never granted. Asked in 2025 who originated the account, Meselson pointed downward rather than at the Kremlin. Initially, he said, he was sure the people at Compound 19 were the source of the lie. Andropov, then head of the KGB, learned the truth early. Yeltsin, Communist Party chief in Sverdlovsk when it happened, later wrote that he had asked Andropov what caused it and never received a reply. In December 1990, the Soviet Council of Ministers ordered the destruction of all documents relating to the outbreak. There had been minimal internal investigation, and nobody held to account. The account had by then stood for 11 years. It broke in the Soviet press first, not the Western one. In August 1990, Natalia Zheneva published an investigation in Literaturnaya Gazeta that questioned the official version and prompted calls for a new inquiry. In October 1991, the Wall Street Journal sent its Moscow bureau chief, Peter Gumbel, to the city. He interviewed families, doctors, and hospital staff, and reported the account riddled with inconsistencies and plain falsehoods. In November 1991, Izvestia quoted a retired general who said he had learned from the KGB that someone arrived early in the morning and began work without turning on the safety filters. That sentence is the origin of the most repeated explanation of this accident anywhere. The version usually told runs like this. A technician removed a clogged filter and left a note. The next shift restarted production without reading it. That account comes from Kanajan Alibekov, later Ken Alibek, first deputy chief of Biopreparat. He was not in Sverdlovsk in 1979. He described it from what colleagues told him afterwards. So the most widely repeated explanation of the deadliest confirmed laboratory leak on record comes from one defector, recalling other people's conversations. It matches the Izvestia report and Russian descriptions of an exhaust fault. No release document confirms it. Meselson, asked directly, said he did not know whether the filter story was true. What he was certain of was the form. It was an aerosol, not a spill. Liquid does not travel 50 kilometers. In February 1992, Yeltsin told President Bush the outbreak had been a military accident. In May, he said so publicly. The KGB, he said, had told him that Soviet military development was the cause. He had been the party leader in that city when it happened, and had asked at the time and been told nothing. 13 years later, he was the head of state, confirming his own government's account was false. Meselson's team reached Yekaterinburg in June 1992 and returned in August 93. The hospital records were gone. What survived was a list, and the people on the list had families who were still there. A member of the Russian parliament, Larisa Mishustina, had written to Yeltsin for her constituents. They wanted to know whether the epidemic had been caused by government activity, because if so, they were entitled to double pension money. The reply carried names, dates of birth, and addresses. She gave Meselson a photocopy. The state's own compensation paperwork, produced to settle a pensions question, became the sampling frame for the investigation that undid the state's account. Jeanne Guillemin, a medical anthropologist and Meselson's wife, went to the addresses herself. She knocked, said she was from the university and was studying health, and asked to talk. She was invited in at every house but one. The questionnaire asked a great many things. One question decided the case, not where the person had lived, but where they had been during the daytime on the 2nd of April, 1979. Home addresses formed no pattern. Daytime locations did. Plotted on satellite maps of the city, they fell inside a narrow band running south from the military facility, past the city limit, to the villages where livestock had died. The furthest was 50 kilometers out. There were two apparent exceptions, both lorry drivers whose routes crossed the band. Meselson has called the result a classic of epidemiology and said the credit belongs to his wife. Wind observations go every 3 hours to the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva, and the Soviet Union had reported like everyone else. There was one day, and one day only, on which the wind held that direction from morning to night, which returns to the paper. The outbreak resulted from the windborne spread of an aerosol of anthrax pathogen. The source was the military microbiology facility. The escape occurred during the day on Monday, the 2nd of April. It is also, the paper states, the largest documented outbreak of human inhalation anthrax. Meselson had spent 14 years reaching a position that contradicted the one he had reported in '86, and he published it. The number of dead does not resolve, and this episode is not going to pretend otherwise. Meselson's team was handed a list of 68 names before it arrived and reported at least 68 deaths in the city. The same investigation has been reported as 77 cases and 66 deaths. Frontline gives 94 affected and at least 64 dead. A Russian official figure is 95 infected and 68 dead, with the note that the real number was larger. Contemporary American estimates in 1980 ran from 200 to 2,000. Those were not counts. They were inferences drawn from the size of the cleanup, and the analysts making them said so at the time. This episode uses 68 because it is the only figure that can be attached to named people. It is a floor and not a total. The records that would settle it were confiscated in '79 and ordered destroyed in '90. In 2016, tissue specimens preserved by the Sverdlovsk pathologists in '79 and handed to Meselson in '92 were sequenced. The strain was ordinary. There was no engineered resistance to antibiotics or vaccine in the genome. Meselson's comment on that finding was short. It did not mean the strain was not nasty. It was extracted, he said, from people who were killed by it. The Russian Federation has since returned to the contaminated meat explanation. The institute at Compound 19 operates today as the 48th Central Scientific Research Institute under United States sanctions since 2021. No Western inspector has been inside.